My first job when I returned from London back here was a job in the boondocks, but I won't mention which boondocks. And then finally I managed to extricate myself from the boondocks and I came to Delhi. And the excitement of Delhi was precisely that one met people. One met vibrant people, one met thinking people, one met the kind of people that made life worthwhile. And among the people that I met were Susanne and Lloyd Rudolph. Partly, they weren't very regular on these walks, I must say. We were all much more regular than they were, but nevertheless. But they lived in Old Delhi. Initially, I think they checked into the rather dilapidated Maiden's Hotel. It was dilapidated in those days, it isn't so now, which had become the kind of adda of foreign scholars coming out on fieldwork who would all go and live there, partly because it was close, of course, to Delhi University. And initially, I used to often think, what made this young woman, she was then, choose to work on India? Because she was, after all, her childhood was all in Germany. She was 9 years old when her parents and she fled from Nazi Germany in 1939 to America, sought asylum and established themselves. And the family was really quite remarkable in the sense that everyone managed to establish themselves very nicely in especially the intellectual world of the States. And Susanne, of course, moved with Lloyd into the study of India. And I think it had something to do with the fact also that it was a time when, after World War II, area studies were becoming very important. And people were running around and saying, which area do we study? And Sue and Lloyd decided that they were going to study South Asia. Part of the reason perhaps was because the study of South Asia also meant the study of what was then popularly called Indian Civ. And Chicago was a great center of Indian Civ. So when they moved to Chicago, there was this big development of Indian Civ. But I think really what drew them as political scientists into this kind of interest was the fact also that it was after World War II that the social sciences began to be framed, founded, established, particularly in places like India. And Delhi was, of course, a big center where the social sciences took off. One has to only think of the excitement of all the megastars at the Delhi School of Economics in the 60s to realize how important this was in that period of time. So there we all were as university people, university teachers, researchers, writers, and so on. And there was this flood of people coming in from different American universities. But of course, the very impressive bunch that came in from Chicago, because Chicago was at this time moving towards becoming the big focus of South Asia social sciences. And so you had the Milton Singers, you had the Barney Cohns, you had the Van Buitenens, and Ed Dimmock, Kim Marriott, all these people that came in together with Sue and Lloyd in the sense of being in India at the same sort of time and being in different parts of India, but somehow our paths seem to cross in Delhi much more. The nice thing about this bunch of people that many of us commented on, of course, was that they were not like the immediately post-independence British scholars of India. The Brits had much more of the colonial edge and what some of us like to now think of as the Indological edge, whereas this was not the case with the people that were coming in from universities in the States. That was really one very substantial difference. Not that the American university hadn't had Indian studies before. Some of the biggest centers of Sanskrit studies, for example, were located in places like Harvard and later on Chicago and places like that. But it was, politics, sociology, anthropology, law, demography, not so much history, a little bit of history, but the history developed again a little later. But all these disciplines that came in and began to speak to each other, and we were sitting around listening to this conversation and then participating in this conversation. And it did make a lot of difference to the way many of us began to look at our own disciplines. But I really got to know them much more, very fully, the foundation of a friendship, in April 1968. They were then heading the Indian Civ program in Chicago. And so I got a letter from them saying, would I like to come to Chicago University for a month and deliver 4 lectures on any aspect of ancient Indian history that I chose. And I was, of course, delighted because this was my first invitation to an American university. And it would have, I looked forward to seeing all these people on their home ground because I'd only met them in Delhi. So I arrived in Chicago and I went to the faculty club where they booked me in. And I was about to start unpacking when the news came through, it's April 68, that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And within minutes of my hearing this news and sitting down and thinking, oh, now what happens? This is not the best time to be in Chicago. There was a knock on the door. I opened the door. Sue and Lloyd were standing there saying, pick up your bags. We're taking you home. And I said, what do you mean you're taking me home? And they said, you can't live here by yourself in this situation. The whole city is under siege. So you will come and live with us for the month that you're in Chicago. And I said, you don't really know me all that very well. You're taking me to your home for a month? Are you out of your mind? And they said, no, you will come. And so my bags were picked up and I was taken off. And that was when I really got to see them, not in their avatar only of being professors of political science and conducting in-civ courses in Chicago, but seeing them on home ground, picnicking on Sundays with the children, having parties at home almost once a week. They were great entertainers. And really beginning to get a feel of the place and the society in much the same way as Susanne talks about getting a feel of society in Delhi. This was a kind of reverse process which I enjoyed very much indeed. And it was a process in which we had very intense debates. That one of the joys of conversations with them was that a conversation could be lighthearted and it could be jokey, and then suddenly one moved into a very serious issue and had a very substantial conversation. And this was something I greatly enjoyed. Not that we always agreed on the question of state formation, for example. We had great problems when they would say, so what was it like in early times? And I would say nothing like what you're describing for the Mughal period or the British times. It was quite different and so on. And we would argue back and forth on that. And of course, this was the period in which the notion of tradition was very strong. There'd been all the talk about the great tradition and the little tradition, and then the whole business about to what extent do you carry a tradition with you when you modernize, and this is an area on which they, in fact, wrote very extensively. Made many of us think twice about what did we really mean by tradition when we use that term in our own writing. And there was, of course, caste in politics, caste in history, therefore, it always went back. Religion as a social enterprise. This is again something that one was beginning to think of in those days and hadn't really thought of it very much before. So it was really an extremely exhilarating, invigorating kind of time that you spent if you had a few minutes of conversation or a few hours of conversation with them. And it was also this ability of, doesn't matter where you met them at what time, especially Sue, there was a kind of sense of continuing the conversation from last time. The discussions were there and you picked them up and you continue to talk about them. And I must confess at the end of it, the friendship that I developed after staying with them for a month and then repeatedly going back to the University of Chicago, we had an unwritten agreement that every time I went to speak at any American university, I would have to make a day tour and go to Chicago and give a talk there as well. And of course, Jaipur, as has been mentioned, was the great winter resort of many of us. We would go down for weekends and spend time there. And I developed a really tremendously deep admiration for Susanne particularly, given her background, given the way in which she had to struggle against the first alien culture, which was American, and then to try and understand a culture which was not so easy to understand, which was Indian, and particularly Rajasthani, if I may say so. So one really began to see the tremendously difficult way in which she and Lloyd got over this obstacle of understanding cultures, or if they didn't get over it completely. None of us ever get over the obstacle of understanding any culture, even our own, but at least coming to terms with it to some degree. But what always struck me in all our conversations, and when I saw her giving lectures, participating in seminars, was the not just her brilliance, but the quickness of her mind, the way she was able to pick up ideas very quickly and link them, one idea to another. And before you knew what was what, she was going off talking about things that you hadn't even thought of when the idea was first mentioned. And this comes through in the writing, but I think in some ways it was much more scintillating in the discussions, and the seminars. And maybe that was just that I'm a lazy reader and I prefer to just listen to people when they speak. And then, of course, there was this whole thing about she was extremely elegant and well turned out, there's no question. And let me conclude by saying that perhaps one of the most impressive things about knowing them was the relationship that they had between the two of them, Sue and Lloyd. It was not the formal husband and wife relationship. It was not even a more informal relationship. It was a relationship that was so deeply integrated that sometimes I used to wonder that really this was quite an extraordinary situation. And I'm told by the family that when Lloyd spoke recently in California at the condolence meeting, he referred to Sue as the love of his life. And I'm sure that if it had been the reverse situation, she would have said the same thing about Lloyd. And this was just so true of them, that in fact, seeing them together, talking to them, spending time with them together, there was an aspect of this, a kind of human aspect, an emotional aspect, which I must confess that sometimes I found even more attractive than their intellectual brilliance.
JNU has a political, different kind of people have different opinions. But I think media is not looking at the academic activism which I called in JNU. Which is much, much stronger than what is reflected in the media.
Watch Eureka with Professor S.K. Soubry former Vice Chancellor JNU, on Rajya Sabha TV.
The sacred relics of Buddha were unearthed in Piprava in Uttar Pradesh. Buddhist monks from all over the world visit the National Museum to pay their respects. These charred bone fragments of Buddha are housed in the gold canopy gifted by the royal family of Thailand.
I was a student of the Rudolphs. The first course I took was with Susanne in 1965, after my Fulbright year in India, when Olive Reddick's last year, in fact. I have, in 1974, I defended my, I got married. The next day, defended my dissertation, and shortly thereafter moved into the Rudolph house for the summer when I was helping with their foreign policy book, ultimately, which was then a U.S. National Commission report on the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. I have had the honor of replacing them, teaching their courses at Chicago for one quarter. And Veena and I have been on many occasions, their 25th wedding anniversary, their 40th wedding anniversary. Veena in 1974, when Susanne came to give the commencement speech for the summer graduation, forced Susanne to write in her own visitor's book, and I don't know whether that ever happened again. So all of these things are just simply, and finally I was co-chair of their Festschrift committee, a conference in which several people here were present. But what I want to just talk about very, very briefly has been stimulated by the book that her brother Frank has edited of the correspondence of her parents while in 1938-39. And it's been touched on briefly, but I think that it's an important part of understanding Susanne in particular. I like to think of this as she and I coming out in some sense of the same German egg. And it turns out, and that I learned fairly quickly, that there was in fact a very direct connection. That is to say, Susanne's grandfather and my grandfather were both at Kiel University in the early 30s. He was rector. My grandfather was just a professor of jurisprudence. And my mother, who was then a student at the university briefly before Hitler came to power, was actually in class with Susanne's aunt. And so that family connection, as it were, goes back a very, very long way. Susanne at the time was probably 2. I think that there were certain things that I recognized that, as I said, the Germanic egg. Certainly walking. We all walked. That was, to me, something that all Germans did. Susanne and Lloyd, of course, I would walk with them occasionally from their house to campus, and that's where they did their final little preparations for class and so forth. Didn't waste a moment. I had in 1992, Susanne and Lloyd and I and a friend climbed Nag Tibba, for those of you who know what Dune School students do. So that there was the conversations that we had, I felt right at home. So I really felt as a sort of a junior family member, as it were. Looking at the letters that Frank Hoeber has edited, what happened was that Susanne's father was able to go a year earlier to America because his father had, because he'd actually been to America before, arrangements had been made. He was able to get out early on, but Suzanne's mother and Susanne did not have the same sort of permissions and so on. It was a very, very trying, and it was a touch and go thing whether or not they would be able to get out even a year later. That year in 38-39 begins actually with a description of the Kristallnacht destruction that is written about in a way which, I mean, where they were in Frankfurt, there was an enormous impact on that. Susanne at the time would have been 8 and certainly not unaware of what was going on, I would think. She was, according to the letters at least, of course, a superb student with lots of friends in Germany, many of whom did not survive, as we know. I think most importantly, as I was thinking about this, her mother they had to survive. They had no money to speak of. They couldn't get money out of the bank, literally, because of various Nazi regulations. And what the mother did was, and her father had been dismissed basically from his job as her grandfather had been because of their quote-unquote Jewish or non-Aryan heritage. So they had to make a living, and they made a living by setting up an agency to distribute the Frankfurter Zeitung. And Suzanne's mother, basically on her own, did that for a year of this waiting time until they could manage to leave. And that is here you have, and these two, they had some family, and many friends, of course. But I think that some of Suzanne's, contained stability comes from having gone, I suspect, through that experience and seeing her mother, who of course lived for a very long time afterwards and was not, and had many accomplishments as well, carry on in these incredibly difficult circumstances. So I don't want to turn the table on the Rudolphs and try and psychoanalyze them in any way, but I suspect that this particular book and this particular experience must have had some sort of important impact. I too would like to speak about the difficulty of disentangling one Rudolph from the other in our minds in terms of what they did and how they spoke. Those of us who were primarily Lloyd students, no one was the student of one or the other. We both, that was understood. But I was primarily Lloyd's student. He was the chair of my committee. In fact, Susanne was not on my committee, although she read my thesis and things of that sort. Those of us who are Lloyd students push a little bit back against those who saw Susanne as the star of the couple, which is, I think, most people's first impression. But those of us, and I think you've heard that here this evening, who had a longer time to be with them, understood that they had a very important kind of what I would call a contrapuntal harmony in the way they thought, in the way they dealt with each other, and in the way that, of course, they allowed others in. So I see them as sometimes one or the other carrying the fundamental line, and the other doing the ornamentation, the other doing interesting variations, bringing in a third voice or a fourth voice when it became necessary, but at the same time producing an absolutely wonderful harmony, which sometimes took a long time to mature, so that Lakshmi, which was supposed to be a book published in the early 1980s, didn't appear until 5, 6, 7 years later, when it was not, it had outlived its original purpose. The Amar Singh Diary project, when it took, gosh, how many years? 25 years or so to come to final fruition. But in the, pardon? 29 years, sorry, 29 years, my mistake. But what a wonderful piece of work it was, when it finally came. And I think how harmonic and what beautiful music almost all of their texts contain. Thank you.